Literature, with its vast and diverse landscapes, has long served as a medium for exploring the deepest recesses of the human experience. Among its most powerful and poignant themes is that of trauma and healing. Trauma, by its very nature, is disruptive, altering the fabric of a character's psyche, relationships, and understanding of the world. However, literature also offers narratives of healing, often complicated and non-linear, where characters find paths to recovery, reconciliation, or acceptance. In examining trauma and healing in literature, we delve into the stories that expose human suffering and the narratives that allow us to witness resilience. From classical tragedies to modern psychological dramas, trauma provides fertile ground for exploring the human condition. In turn, healing, whether emotional, physical, or psychological, becomes a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. This video will analyze how trauma is depicted across various literary genres, examining key works that explore both the devastating effects of trauma and the complex process of healing. By analyzing characters, narrative structures, and symbolic representations, we will explore how literature serves not only as a reflection of human suffering but also as a guide through the process of healing. Trauma, in literature, is often depicted as an event or series of events that shatter a character's worldview, rendering them vulnerable, alienated, or lost. It can be personal, such as the loss of a loved one, violence, or abuse, or collective, as seen in war narratives or post-colonial literature. Regardless of its form, trauma disrupts the narrative flow of a character's life and is often portrayed as something inescapable. It looms large in the background, affecting every decision, every relationship, and every interaction. In classical literature, trauma is often presented through tragedy. Take, for instance, Sophocles' Oedipus Rex. Oedipus' discovery of his own horrific actions, killing his father and marrying his mother, plunges him into a profound existential crisis. His psychological trauma manifests in self-inflicted blindness, a literal and symbolic act that represents both his desire to escape his painful reality and his need to atone for his sins. Sophocles uses Oedipus' downfall to show how trauma, once realized, can lead to both physical and mental devastation. In William Shakespeare's Hamlet, trauma is embodied in the protagonist's response to the sudden death of his father and his mother's subsequent remarriage to his uncle. Hamlet's grief evolves into a deep psychological trauma, marked by his erratic behavior, existential musings, and desire for revenge. Shakespeare masterfully explores how unresolved trauma can consume a person, leading to a sense of paralysis. Hamlet's famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be," reveals his internal conflict, torn between the desire to end his suffering and the uncertainty of what lies beyond death. In this way, Hamlet's trauma is not just an event but an ongoing psychological burden that affects his very sense of being. As literature has evolved, so too has the depiction of trauma. Modern literature delves deeper into the psychological nuances of trauma, offering more intimate portrayals of characters' inner worlds. Modernist and postmodernist literature, in particular, examines trauma not only as a reaction to a single event but as a prolonged psychological struggle. Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway is a poignant exploration of post-traumatic stress disorder following World War I. The character Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked war veteran, embodies the deep psychological scars left by war. His trauma is internalized, manifesting in hallucinations and an inability to reintegrate into society. Woolf's stream of consciousness style immerses readers in Septimus' fragmented mind, allowing them to experience the disorientation and disconnection that trauma brings. Septimus' eventual suicide is a tragic reminder of how trauma can overwhelm the psyche, leaving healing out of reach for some. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, the trauma of slavery is explored through the character of Seth, a woman who escapes slavery but remains haunted by the ghost of her dead child. Morrison explores generational trauma, illustrating how the horrors of slavery reverberate through Seth's life and the lives of those around her. The trauma manifests both physically, in the ghostly figure of beloved, and psychologically, as Seth grapples with guilt, grief, and a fractured sense of identity. Morrison's novel is a powerful depiction of how historical trauma lingers in the personal and collective consciousness, shaping identities and futures long after the initial trauma has passed. Similarly, Kazuo Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go explores trauma in the context of dystopian science fiction. The novel's characters are clones raised for the purpose of organ donation, and the trauma they experience is tied to their knowledge of their inevitable fate. Ishiguro examines how trauma can stem not from a singular event but from the pervasive awareness of one's mortality and lack of agency. The characters' passive acceptance of their fate reflects a profound, existential trauma that goes beyond the physical. It is a trauma of the soul, rooted in the denial of their humanity. Trauma in literature is not always a solitary experience. In many works, trauma is depicted as collective, affecting entire communities, nations, or generations. War, genocide, colonization, and natural disasters have all served as backdrops for exploring collective trauma in literature. In Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, the trauma of World War I is depicted not just through individual soldiers but as a shared experience among a generation of young men. The novel conveys the futility and horror of war, where trauma becomes an unspoken bond between soldiers who have witnessed unimaginable atrocities. Remarque's detailed and brutal descriptions of the battlefield show how war strips individuals of their humanity, leaving them physically and emotionally scarred. Similarly, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's Half of a Yellow Sun portrays the collective trauma of the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War. Through the perspectives of multiple characters, Adichie shows how war disrupts not only individual lives but also the fabric of society. Families are torn apart, relationships are strained, and the trauma of hunger, displacement, and violence leaves a lasting impact on the nation. Adichie's narrative weaves together personal and historical trauma, emphasizing that healing must occur on both an individual and societal level. Post-colonial literature, too, is rich with depictions of collective trauma. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart explores the trauma of colonization in Nigeria, particularly the disruption of traditional society and identity. The protagonist, Okonkwo, experiences personal trauma as his village is overtaken by European colonizers, but his trauma is symbolic of the larger cultural trauma inflicted upon indigenous communities. The novel examines the psychological toll of cultural displacement and the loss of autonomy, showing how colonization leads to a fractured sense of self and community. While trauma is a central theme in many literary works, the depiction of healing is often more complex and varied. Healing, in literature, is rarely a straightforward process. It is often fraught with setbacks, moments of despair, and a reconfiguration of identity. Healing may come in the form of reconciliation, acceptance, or even death, as characters grapple with the aftermath of trauma. In Haruki Murakami's Norwegian Wood, healing is a slow, painful process that comes through self-reflection and emotional vulnerability. The protagonist, Toru Watanabe, is haunted by the death of his friend and the suicide of his first love, Naoko. Throughout the novel, Toru's journey toward healing involves confronting his grief, developing new relationships, and ultimately accepting the impermanence of life. Murakami's portrayal of healing is subtle, emphasizing that while some wounds may never fully heal, individuals can learn to live with their scars. Similarly, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude portrays healing as an intergenerational process. The Buendia family, plagued by misfortune and trauma, experiences cycles of suffering that seem inescapable. However, the novel suggests that healing comes through understanding one's history and breaking free from the patterns of the past. Marquez uses magical realism to blur the lines between reality and metaphor, suggesting that healing requires not just physical recovery but a spiritual or emotional awakening. In Louise Erdrich's The Round House, healing is depicted as a process of seeking justice and reclaiming agency. The novel explores the trauma of sexual violence within a Native American community and the subsequent quest for justice by the protagonist, Joe. Erdrich highlights the role of community in the healing process, emphasizing the importance of support, solidarity, and the pursuit of justice in overcoming trauma. Healing, in this context, is not just a personal journey but a collective one, as Joe and his community work together to seek justice and rebuild their lives. Literature often employs symbolism and metaphor to deepen the exploration of trauma and healing. Trauma, as an abstract and often overwhelming concept, is frequently represented through images or symbols that give form to the intangible. Similarly, healing is often depicted through symbolic acts or transformations, allowing readers to witness the internal changes that characters undergo. In Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the wallpaper itself becomes a symbol of the protagonist's deteriorating mental state. Trapped in a room by her husband as part of a rest cure for her postpartum depression, the protagonist begins to project her inner turmoil onto the wallpaper. As her psychological trauma deepens, she sees women trapped behind the wallpaper, a metaphor for her own entrapment and helplessness. The act of tearing down the wallpaper at the novel's climax symbolizes both her mental breakdown and her attempt to break free from the oppressive forces in her life. Similarly, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5 uses time travel as a metaphor for the fragmented nature of trauma. The protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, becomes unstuck in time after surviving the bombing of Dresden during World War II. His disjointed experience of time mirrors the way trauma disrupts memory and the linear progression of life. Vonnegut's use of science fiction elements allows him to explore the psychological effects of trauma in a unique and powerful way, showing how survivors of trauma often feel trapped in a perpetual loop, unable to move forward. In Jan Martel's Life of Pi, the survival journey of Pi Patel is laden with symbolic imagery related to both trauma and healing. After surviving a shipwreck, Pi is stranded on a lifeboat with a Bengal tiger, Richard Parker. The tiger becomes a complex symbol of Pi's inner turmoil and survival instincts. As Pi battles for survival, he must confront both the physical challenges of the open sea and the emotional trauma of losing his family in the shipwreck. Richard Parker represents the untamed, primal part of Pi that is awakened by trauma, yet it is also this part of him that allows Pi to survive. By the end of the novel, the ambiguous nature of Pi's story, whether Richard Parker is real or simply a figment of Pi's imagination, leaves readers pondering the ways in which the mind can create alternate realities as a coping mechanism for trauma. One of the most important aspects of healing in literature is the act of storytelling itself. Narratives of trauma often serve a dual purpose. They expose the pain and suffering that characters experience while also offering a form of catharsis. In many ways, the telling of one's trauma is an essential part of the healing process. By giving voice to pain, characters, and by extension, readers, can begin to make sense of their suffering and find a way forward. In Elie Wiesel's Night, a harrowing account of Wiesel's experience in Nazi concentration camps during the Holocaust, the act of writing his story becomes a form of testimony. Wiesel's memoir is both an expression of personal trauma and a collective witness to one of history's greatest atrocities. By sharing his story, Wiesel ensures that the trauma of the Holocaust is not forgotten, and in doing so, he contributes to the healing of a collective memory. The process of writing becomes a way for Wiesel to reclaim his voice after being silenced by the horrors of the camps. Similarly, Maxine Hong Kingston's The Woman Warrior explores the trauma of cultural displacement and the pressure of growing up as a Chinese-American woman in a patriarchal society. Kingston interweaves personal narratives with traditional Chinese folklore to explore her identity and the trauma of her family's past. The blending of myth and memoir highlights how storytelling can serve as a bridge between the past and the present, allowing individuals to reclaim their heritage while also confronting the pain that accompanies it. Kingston's narrative illustrates that healing is not simply about overcoming trauma but about integrating it into one's understanding of self. In Art Spiegelman's Mouse, the use of graphic novel format to depict the trauma of the Holocaust through the eyes of Spiegelman's father adds another dimension to the healing power of narrative. By representing Jews as mice and Nazis as cats, Spiegelman uses allegory to explore the horrors of the Holocaust in a way that allows for both emotional distance and engagement. The act of retelling his father's story becomes a means of understanding intergenerational trauma, showing how the scars of historical events continue to affect descendants. The relationship between Art and his father is central to the narrative, and through the process of recounting his father's experiences, Art finds a way to connect with and process the trauma of his heritage. Trauma and healing are two of the most profound and enduring themes in literature. Through its exploration of personal, collective, and historical trauma, literature offers readers a window into the darkest recesses of the human experience, while also providing a path toward recovery. Whether through intimate character studies, symbolic representations, or the healing power of narrative, literature allows us to confront and understand trauma in ways that are both empathetic and transformative. By giving voice to pain and suffering, literature becomes a space where healing can begin. It reminds us that, though trauma may be an inescapable part of life, the act of telling one's story, whether in words, symbols, or allegories, can offer a way forward. Healing in literature is rarely simple or complete. It is a process, often cyclical and fraught with setbacks. Yet it is through this process that characters, and by extension readers, find strength, resilience, and ultimately, redemption. In examining the myriad ways trauma is depicted in literature, we are reminded of the universality of suffering and the equally universal desire for healing. Literature serves as both a mirror of human pain and a testament to the enduring capacity for growth and recovery. It teaches us that while trauma may shatter our sense of self, healing, however slow and difficult, is possible, and it often begins with the simple act of sharing our stories.